A butcher in 18th century Edinburgh becomes wealthy by selling quality meat at fair prices, never once thinking about the greater good of society. Meanwhile, a wealthy merchant donates generously to charity, driven by genuine concern for the poor. Which person, according to Adam Smith, contributes more to human flourishing? The answer reveals why the thinker most associated with free market capitalism spent his career arguing that human sympathy and moral feeling, not self-interest alone, form the foundation of a just society. Smith's philosophy emerges from a fundamental tension that cuts to the heart of human nature. We are simultaneously creatures of particular attachments and universal moral agents. His entire intellectual architecture attempts to resolve this paradox by showing how the mechanisms of sympathy can generate genuinely impartial moral judgments without requiring us to abandon our deeply felt personal commitments. This creates a theory of ethics that is neither purely rational nor purely emotional, but depends on the sophisticated interplay between feeling and reflection. Part 1. The Impartial Spectator. The Phenomenology of Moral Judgment. A mother watches her child fall and scrape his knee. She immediately feels a sharp pang of distress, not because she is physically hurt, but because, through an act of imaginative projection, she recreates within herself something analogous to her child's pain. This capacity for what Smith calls sympathy operates through what we might call moral imagination. But the philosophical complexity begins immediately when we recognize that this sympathetic response is not passive emotional contagion, but an active, reconstructive process. The mother does not literally feel her child's physical pain. Instead, she imagines what it would be like to be in her child's situation and generates within herself emotions appropriate to that imagined experience. This distinction matters crucially, because it means moral judgment depends not on direct emotional transfer, but on our capacity to construct accurate representations of others' experiences. The quality of our moral judgments therefore depends on the sophistication of our imaginative reconstructions and our ability to correct for systematic biases in how we imagine others' situations. But here we encounter the first deep paradox. If sympathy operates through imagination, and imagination is necessarily shaped by our own experiences and limitations, how can sympathetic responses ever transcend the particularities of our own perspective? The wealthy person imagining poverty draws on memories of temporary inconvenience, not genuine deprivation. The healthy person imagining chronic illness lacks the lived experience of how pain reshapes one's entire relationship to the world. Smith's concept of the impartial spectator attempts to address this problem through a sophisticated form of moral reflection that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When I judge an action, I don't simply ask how I feel about it, but I imaginatively construct how a person with complete information, appropriate emotional sensitivity, but no particular stake in the outcome would respond. This involves what we might call second-order sympathy, where I sympathize not just with the parties involved, but with the responses that an ideally positioned observer would have toward those parties. Consider the phenomenology of this process through a complex moral scenario. A pharmaceutical executive must decide whether to price a life-saving medication at levels that maximize profit but make it inaccessible to many who need it. The executive's immediate sympathies are complex: concern for shareholders, pride in the company's innovation, worry about setting precedents that might discourage future research, and genuine distress about patients who cannot afford treatment. The impartial spectator doesn't eliminate these competing sympathies, but asks a more sophisticated question. Which arrangement of these concerns would seem reasonable to someone who could sympathize equally with all affected parties? The critical insight is that the impartial spectator is not a detached rational calculator, but a more refined form of sympathetic response. The executive must imaginatively inhabit the perspectives of patients, shareholders, researchers, and future patients who might benefit from continued innovation. Then ask, which resolution would seem appropriate to someone capable of feeling the full force of each perspective without being overwhelmed by proximity to any particular interest? This requires not the elimination of emotion, but its systematic cultivation and refinement. But this analysis reveals a deeper philosophical problem that Smith never fully resolves. The impartial spectator seems to require what we might call God's eye view moral knowledge, the ability to weigh incommensurable values from a perspective that transcends human limitations. How can finite beings with necessarily partial information and culturally shaped moral intuitions achieve genuine impartiality? More troubling still, different people's impartial spectators seem to reach systematically different conclusions about identical moral questions, suggesting that the spectator may be less impartial than it appears. The pharmaceutical executive's impartial spectator might focus on individual rights to life-saving treatment, while another executive's spectator emphasizes incentive structures for innovation. A person raised in a culture that prioritizes individual achievement might construct an impartial spectator who weighs entrepreneurial rewards differently than someone from a more communitarian background. If the impartial spectator reflects our deepest moral commitments, and those commitments vary across cultures and individuals, then moral judgment remains relative despite its aspiration to universality. Smith's response to this objection operates on several levels and reveals the sophisticated social dimension of his moral theory. First, he argues that the impartial spectator develops through social interaction and is therefore not purely individual, but shaped by ongoing community engagement. Our capacity for impartial judgment improves through exposure to others' perspectives, criticism of our initial responses, and gradual refinement of our sympathetic capacities through moral education and social experience. The executive's moral judgment becomes more reliable not through isolated reflection, but through engaging with stakeholders, considering public debate, and testing initial moral intuitions against others' reasoned responses. Second, Smith recognizes that moral standards themselves evolve through this social process. The impartial spectator of one era might find slavery acceptable, while a later era's spectator finds it obviously wrong. This doesn't relativize moral judgment, but shows how moral knowledge progresses through collective reflection and the gradual expansion of our sympathetic capacities. We become capable of more genuinely impartial judgment not by transcending our social context, but by participating in its moral development and subjecting our judgments to increasingly sophisticated forms of scrutiny. The deepest insight emerges when we recognize that Smith's theory makes moral judgment both objective and social without making it either purely rational or purely conventional. The impartial spectator aims at objective moral truth, but that truth is accessible only through the refinement of our sympathetic responses in community with others. Moral objectivity doesn't require stepping outside human experience, but achieving the most sophisticated and comprehensive form of human moral response possible, given our nature as sympathetic social beings. This creates a conception of moral progress that is neither relativistic nor dogmatically universalist, but depends on the ongoing cultivation of our capacity for accurate and expansive moral imagination. Part 2. The Limits of Sympathy. Why Distance Destroys Moral Feeling. A man in London reads that an earthquake in China has killed millions of people. He expresses appropriate sorrow, perhaps donates to relief efforts, then goes to bed and sleeps peacefully. The next morning, he discovers he will lose his little finger in an accident, and this prospect disturbs his rest far more than the distant catastrophe affecting millions. Smith uses this thought experiment to expose a fundamental problem with sympathy-based ethics. Our moral feelings diminish with physical, social and temporal distance in ways that seem to make genuine impartiality impossible. The philosophical challenge cuts deeper than simple bias or selfishness. Sympathy operates through imaginative identification, but imagination requires concrete details, familiar experiences and emotional connections that naturally become weaker as distance increases. We can imagine losing a finger because we understand physical pain, and can visualize the specific inconveniences it would create. We cannot truly imagine the experience of millions dying in an earthquake because the scale exceeds our psychological capacity, and the victims remain abstract to us. This limitation creates what we might call the moral distance problem, that threatens to undermine Smith's entire ethical system. If the impartial spectator depends on sympathetic responses, and sympathetic responses systematically favour the near over the far, the familiar over the foreign, and the individual over the statistical, then moral judgment will be systematically biased toward parochial concerns. The impartial spectator begins to look like a sophisticated rationalization of partial attachments rather than a genuine source of universal moral standards. Consider how this plays out in contemporary moral dilemmas that Smith could not have anticipated, but his theory must address. A wealthy individual decides how to allocate charitable giving between local homeless shelters and international malaria prevention programs. Economic analysis shows clearly that dollars prevent far more suffering when spent on malaria nets in developing countries than on homeless services in wealthy cities. But the potential donor can visit local shelters, meet specific individuals and witness directly how contributions improve particular lives. The distant malaria victims remain statistical abstractions, despite representing vastly greater aggregate suffering. If the impartial spectator relies on sympathetic response, it will systematically favour the less effective but more emotionally vivid local option. Smith's analysis of this problem reveals sophisticated insights about the social construction of moral concern. He argues that the decay of sympathy with distance is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of human psychology that serves important functions. Strong, sympathetic responses to immediate circumstances motivate the intensive care and attention that sustain families, communities, and local institutions. If we felt equally strongly about all human suffering, regardless of distance, we might become paralyzed by the vastness of global misery, or spread our attention so thin as to be ineffective everywhere. But this functional analysis creates a deeper philosophical tension. If partiality serves valuable purposes, how can we distinguish appropriate partiality from mere bias? The racist who claims stronger sympathy for members of his own group, and the nationalist who prioritizes fellow citizens might invoke the same functional arguments Smith uses to defend family attachments. Where exactly do we draw the line between natural and appropriate limitations on sympathy versus problematic moral blindness? Smith's solution involves distinguishing between different types of distance and different reasons for sympathetic limitation. Physical and temporal distance create natural limits on our information and emotional capacity that the impartial spectator can acknowledge and compensate for through reflection. When we recognize that geographic distance makes us less aware of others' suffering, we can consciously adjust our moral judgments to account for this bias. Social distance, based on irrelevant characteristics like race or class, however, represents a failure of moral imagination that the impartial spectator should reject. The key distinction lies between limitations imposed by human cognitive constraints versus limitations imposed by prejudice or willful ignorance. This analysis leads to a more nuanced understanding of how the impartial spectator operates across different scales of moral concern. For immediate interpersonal relationships, sympathetic responses provide rich and generally reliable moral guidance. For distant or large-scale moral questions, the impartial spectator must rely more heavily on general principles derived from sympathetic responses but applied through reflection rather than direct feeling. The charitable donor, facing the local versus global dilemma, illustrates this process. The impartial spectator cannot directly sympathize with statistical victims of malaria, but it can recognize that the local homeless individuals who evoke stronger sympathy are not inherently more deserving of concern than distant malaria victims. Through reflection on what makes suffering matter morally, the spectator can endorse principles that transcend the limitations of direct sympathetic response while remaining grounded in the moral insights that sympathy provides in clearer cases. This creates a form of moral reasoning that extends sympathetic insights beyond sympathy's natural range without abandoning its foundation in human feeling. The resolution suggests that Smith's moral theory operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Direct sympathetic response guides judgment in immediate interpersonal situations where we have adequate information and emotional access. Principled reflection, guided by sympathetic insights, addresses moral questions that exceed the natural scope of direct sympathy. Social institutions and cultural practices shape the contexts within which both processes operate, expanding or contracting the boundaries of moral concern over historical time. This creates a complex but coherent account of how finite beings with limited sympathetic capacities can nevertheless make progress toward more genuinely impartial moral judgment. Part 3. Self-interest properly understood. Beyond narrow selfishness. A baker rises before dawn to knead dough, not from love of humanity, but because he needs to support his family and build his business. By evening, hundreds of people have fresh bread, and the baker has earned honest wages through labour that serves genuine human needs. This scenario, central to Smith's economic thinking, is often misinterpreted as endorsing pure selfishness, but the philosophical reality proves far more complex and morally sophisticated. Smith's conception of self-interest operates on multiple levels that critics often collapse into crude egoism. The baker's self-interest includes immediate material concerns like profit and security, but also encompasses what we might call social self-interest. His concern for reputation, social standing, and the approval of others. Additionally, it includes moral self-interest. his desire to see himself as a decent person worthy of self-respect. These different dimensions of self-interest often conflict, creating internal tensions that shape behavior in ways that simple egoistic models cannot capture. Consider how this works through a more complex business scenario that tests the boundaries of Smith's analysis. A pharmaceutical company develops a breakthrough treatment for a rare disease affecting children. The research cost millions and represents genuine innovation that required years of risky investment. Pure economic self-interest suggests pricing the treatment to maximize return on investment, potentially making it accessible only to wealthy families. But the broader conception of self-interest Smith actually endorses includes the company executives' desire for social approval, their concern for professional reputation, and their need to see themselves as contributing positively to human welfare. The critical insight is that self-interest, properly understood, is shaped by social context in ways that align individual motivation with collective benefit without requiring altruistic sacrifice. The pharmaceutical executives face genuine social pressure, media scrutiny, and professional judgment that make purely extractive pricing strategies costly in terms of reputation and future business relationships. More subtly, they face internal psychological costs from acting in ways that conflict with their moral self-image and the approval of colleagues whose opinions they value. Self-interest thus includes the interest in maintaining relationships, reputation and self-respect that depend on being seen as reasonable and fair. But this analysis immediately confronts a powerful objection that reveals the limits of Smith's optimistic view. What happens when social institutions fail to align self-interest with collective benefit? Consider markets where consumers lack information to evaluate quality, where externalities impose costs on third parties, or where regulatory capture allows businesses to profit through political influence rather than genuine value creation. In such contexts, the broader conception of self-interest might still favor socially harmful behavior if that behavior is rewarded by existing institutions and social norms. A contemporary example illustrates this problem clearly. Social media platforms profit from capturing user attention, which creates incentives to promote engaging content regardless of its truth or social value. Platform executives may genuinely care about their social reputation and moral self-image, but they operate within competitive markets and shareholder expectations that reward attention maximization over truth promotion. Their self-interest, even broadly conceived, aligns with business models that may undermine democratic discourse and social trust. The social approval they seek comes primarily from industry peers and investors who share similar incentive structures, rather than from the broader public affected by their decisions. Smith's response to this challenge involves his theory of institutional design and the role of government in creating frameworks that better align individual and collective interests. The problem is not that self-interest is inherently antisocial, but that poorly designed institutions can channel self-interested behavior in destructive directions. Well-designed institutions, including markets with appropriate regulation, legal frameworks that internalize externalities, and social norms that reward genuine value creation, can redirect self-interest towards socially beneficial outcomes. This requires active attention to institutional design rather than naive faith that self-interest automatically serves the common good. The deeper philosophical point concerns the relationship between individual psychology and social structure in shaping human behavior. Smith rejects both crude behaviorist accounts that reduce people to simple pleasure-seeking machines and naive moralist accounts that expect people to routinely sacrifice self-interest for abstract principles. Instead, he develops a sophisticated understanding of how social contexts shape the expression of self-interest in ways that can promote either individual flourishing and social cooperation or individual gain at social expense. The key insight is that self-interest itself is socially constructed and historically variable, rather than a fixed aspect of human nature. This leads to a nuanced view of commercial society that neither celebrates nor condemns self-interested behaviour, but analyses the conditions under which such behaviour contributes to human flourishing. The baker serving bread represents self-interest operating within institutional contexts, social norms, and competitive pressures that reward genuine service to others' needs. The social media executive represents self-interest operating within different institutional contexts that may reward behaviour harmful to broader social interests. The moral evaluation focuses not on the presence or absence of self-interest, which Smith considers universal and ineliminable, but on whether social institutions successfully channel that self-interest in beneficial directions. The resolution points towards Smith's broader project of understanding how commercial societies can cultivate forms of self-interest that are enlightened rather than narrow, socially embedded rather than antisocial, and constrained by institutions that reward genuine value creation over rent-seeking or exploitation. This requires ongoing attention to institutional reform, moral education and social criticism that helps people recognize when their immediate self-interest conflicts with their broader and longer-term interests in living in a just and flourishing society. Part 4. The Invisible Hand. Spontaneous Order and its Discontents. A wealthy Roman landowner decides to build an elaborate villa, motivated entirely by personal vanity and the desire to impress his peers. To construct this monument to his ego, he employs hundreds of workers, purchases materials from dozens of suppliers, and commissions artwork from craftsmen throughout the region. Despite his purely selfish motives, his project provides employment, stimulates trade, and distributes wealth throughout the community in ways that benefit thousands of people he never intended to help. Smith uses this example to illustrate what he calls the invisible hand, the mechanism by which individual actions pursuing private ends can generate beneficial social outcomes without conscious coordination or benevolent intention. The philosophical significance of this concept extends far beyond economics to fundamental questions about social order, human agency, and moral responsibility. Smith suggests that beneficial social outcomes can emerge from the uncoordinated actions of individuals pursuing their own interests, which seems to imply that good intentions are unnecessary for good results, and perhaps that social planning is inferior to spontaneous market processes. But this interpretation raises immediate moral and practical questions about when we can rely on spontaneous order versus when conscious coordination and regulation become necessary. The invisible hand mechanism operates through what modern complexity theorists would recognize as emergent properties of complex adaptive systems. Individual actors responding to local incentives and information generate patterns of social coordination that no single actor planned or foresaw. The Roman landowner's consumption decisions send price signals throughout the economy that coordinate the activities of workers, suppliers and craftsmen without requiring any central authority to direct their efforts. Market prices aggregate dispersed information about preferences, costs and opportunities in ways that guide individual decisions toward collectively beneficial outcomes. But the philosophical complexity begins when we examine the conditions under which this mechanism works effectively versus when it breaks down. Consider a contemporary example that tests the limits of invisible hand coordination, climate change and fossil fuel consumption. Individual consumers purchasing gasoline face prices that reflect extraction, refining and distribution costs, but not the environmental externalities imposed on future generations. Each consumer's rational self-interest leads them to purchase fuel at market prices. But the aggregate effect of millions of such decisions creates climate risks that no individual intended and that markets alone cannot address. The problem reveals a fundamental tension in Smith's thinking between his optimism about spontaneous coordination and his recognition that market outcomes depend on institutional frameworks that markets themselves cannot create. The invisible hand works when property rights are secure, contracts are enforceable, competition is genuine, and prices reflect true social costs and benefits. But establishing and maintaining these conditions requires legal systems, regulatory frameworks and social institutions that emerge from collective deliberation and political action rather than spontaneous market processes. The invisible hand thus presupposes a visible hand of institutional design and social coordination. Smith's analysis becomes more sophisticated when we recognize that he discusses the invisible hand in three distinct contexts that modern interpreters often conflate. First, in the theory of moral sentiments, he uses it to describe how wealthy individuals' consumption creates employment and income distribution, despite their selfish motives. Second, in the wealth of nations, he applies it to international trade, arguing that individuals seeking profitable investments direct capital towards domestically productive uses even without intending to benefit their country. Third, he invokes it more generally to describe how competitive markets coordinate individual decisions toward efficient resource allocation. Each context involves different mechanisms and assumptions that create different possibilities for market failure or success. The most philosophically interesting case involves the relationship between individual virtue and social outcomes. The invisible hand seems to suggest that social benefits can emerge from private vices, which appears to contradict Smith's emphasis on moral sentiments and virtuous character in his ethical writings. Does the invisible hand make individual morality irrelevant to social flourishing, or does it depend on certain moral preconditions that markets cannot themselves generate? A complex business scenario illuminates this tension. A corporation decides whether to invest in worker training programs that would increase productivity, but also increase workers' outside employment options, potentially raising labour costs. Pure short-term profit maximisation might discourage such investment, but longer-term self-interest could favour it if trained workers are more productive and loyal, if the company's reputation for employee development attracts better applicants, and if industry-wide skill development creates positive spillovers that benefit all firms. The invisible hand mechanism works here only if market institutions reward longer-term thinking, if reputation effects operate effectively, and if competitive dynamics don't punish firms for making socially beneficial investments that rivals avoid. Smith's deeper insight concerns the co-evolution of market institutions and moral norms in ways that can either reinforce or undermine the conditions for beneficial invisible hand coordination. Commercial societies tend to develop norms of honesty, reliability and fair dealing because these traits become economically valuable in repeated interactions and reputation-based markets. But the same societies may also erode traditional forms of social solidarity, community engagement, and concern for collective goods that cannot be provided through market mechanisms. The invisible hand may work well for coordinating private goods production while failing to address public goods provision, environmental protection, or social solidarity. The resolution requires recognizing that the invisible hand describes a powerful but limited mechanism for social coordination that works best within institutional frameworks designed to align individual and collective interests. Smith never argued that markets alone could solve all social problems or that government intervention is always counterproductive. Instead, he identified conditions under which spontaneous coordination works well, and implied the need for conscious institutional design to create and maintain those conditions. The invisible hand becomes visible only when we understand the institutional infrastructure that makes beneficial spontaneous coordination possible, while recognizing the limits of what such coordination can achieve. Part 5. The Division of Labour. How specialization creates and destroys human potential. 10 workers in a pin factory, each performing a single specialized task, can produce 48,000 pins in a day. The same 10 workers, each attempting to make complete pins individually, might struggle to produce 20 pins between them. This dramatic productivity increase through division of labour represents one of Smith's most important economic insights, but it creates a profound philosophical tension. The same specialization that multiplies society's productive capacity may diminish individual human development in ways that threaten both personal fulfillment and democratic citizenship. The productivity gains from specialization operate through multiple mechanisms that Smith analyzes with remarkable precision. First, workers develop superior dexterity and skill when focusing on narrow tasks rather than switching between different activities. Second, specialization eliminates time lost in moving between different workstations and changing tools. Third, concentrated attention on specific problems leads to innovations and improvements that workers performing many tasks would never discover. These individual effects multiply across entire economies as specialized producers exchange their products, allowing each person to benefit from everyone else's specialized expertise. But Smith recognizes immediately that extreme specialization creates what we might call the human development paradox of commercial society. The pin factory worker who spends entire days performing one simple operation naturally loses, therefore, the habit of an exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. The same division of labour that increases society's overall productive capacity may reduce individual workers to what Smith describes as human machines, capable of performing their specialized tasks efficiently but losing the broader intellectual and moral capacities that define human flourishing. Consider how this tension plays out in contemporary knowledge work that Smith could not have anticipated. A software engineer specializes in database optimization algorithms, developing extraordinary expertise in this narrow domain while remaining largely ignorant of user interface design, business strategy, and the broader social implications of the system she creates. Her specialization allows her to contribute to complex technological systems that no individual could create alone, but it may also leave her intellectually dependent on others' expertise and unable to engage as a fully informed citizen in democratic deliberations about technology policy. The division of labour that makes modern technological civilization possible may undermine the human capacities that such civilization ostensibly serves. The philosophical complexity deepens when we recognize that Smith presents this as a tragic trade-off built into the structure of commercial society rather than a problem with obvious solutions. Attempts to reduce specialization would sacrifice the productivity gains that make modern living standards possible, potentially condemning society to widespread poverty and limited opportunities for human development. But accepting extreme specialization risks creating what Marx would later call alienated labor, that treats human beings as mere inputs in production processes rather than as ends in themselves worthy of respect and full development. Smith thus identifies a fundamental tension between efficiency and human dignity that haunts all modern economic systems. The problem becomes more acute when we examine specialization's effects on social and political relationships. In traditional societies, individuals possessed diverse skills and knowledge that made them relatively self-sufficient and gave them broad understanding of their community's productive activities. Specialized workers in commercial societies become radically interdependent, relying on complex networks of exchange relationships with people they never meet and whose work they barely understand. This interdependence can create social bonds and mutual cooperation, but it can also generate vulnerability, anxiety, and a sense of powerlessness that undermines both individual well-being and civic engagement. A contemporary example illustrates how these dynamics operate in practice. During the COVID-19 pandemic, highly specialized global supply chains proved extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption, leading to shortages of everything from computer chips to medical supplies. The efficiency gains from extreme specialization and geographic distribution of production created systemic risks that no individual firm anticipated or could address independently. Workers and communities that had specialized in particular industries found themselves economically devastated when global demand patterns shifted, while their narrow skill sets made adaptation to new economic circumstances difficult and slow. The same specialization that had generated prosperity in stable times created fragility and insecurity when conditions changed. Smith's analysis of this problem reveals his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between economic and political institutions. He argues that government has a crucial role in providing education that can partially offset the narrowing effects of specialization by ensuring that even highly specialized workers maintain broader intellectual capacities. Public education becomes necessary not just for individual development, but for preserving the civic virtues and intellectual capabilities that democratic society requires. Without such education, commercial society risks creating a population that is economically productive, but politically passive and intellectually impoverished. But even this solution creates new tensions that Smith does not fully resolve. If specialization is driven by competitive pressures and efficiency considerations, how can society maintain the broad-based education and intellectual development that specialization tends to undermine? Won't employers prefer workers who are maximally specialized and therefore maximally productive in their narrow domains, rather than workers who maintain broader but less immediately useful intellectual capabilities? The market forces that drive specialization may systematically oppose the educational investments that would preserve human development against specialization's narrowing effects. The resolution points towards Smith's broader vision of institutional design that balances efficiency with human flourishing. Commercial society requires conscious attention to preserving and developing human capacities that markets alone will not adequately support. This includes not only formal education but also political institutions that engage citizens in meaningful deliberation, cultural institutions that cultivate broad intellectual and aesthetic development, and economic institutions that provide some protection against the insecurities and vulnerabilities that extreme specialization creates. The division of labor represents human progress, but progress that requires careful institutional design to ensure that increased productive capacity serves genuine human flourishing rather than merely economic efficiency. Part 6. Price as Information: The Distributed Intelligence of Market Systems. A drought in Argentina reduces wheat harvests, immediately affecting bread prices in London bakeries without any central authority coordinating the adjustment. The Argentine farmers never communicate directly with English bakers, government officials issue no directives, and no single person possesses complete information about global wheat supplies and demands. Yet within weeks, higher prices signal scarcity throughout the international economy, encouraging conservation, stimulating increased production in other regions, and guiding resources toward their most valued uses with a precision that no planning authority could match. This phenomenon reveals what Smith identifies as one of market systems' most remarkable characteristics: their ability to coordinate the knowledge and actions of millions of people through the simple mechanism of voluntary exchange at flexible prices. The philosophical significance of this process extends far beyond technical economics to fundamental questions about knowledge, communication, and social coordination. Smith recognizes that the price system operates as a kind of distributed information processing mechanism that aggregates dispersed knowledge about local conditions, individual preferences, and productive opportunities in ways that guide individual decisions toward collectively rational outcomes. No individual or institution needs to possess complete information about the economy's total structure for the system to exhibit intelligence and adaptability at the aggregate level. This suggests profound implications for debates about the relative merits of centralized planning versus decentralized decision-making in complex social systems. But the mechanism's sophistication creates immediate philosophical puzzles about the relationship between individual rationality and collective intelligence. Individual market participants typically know very little about the broader economic forces affecting their decisions and may hold completely mistaken beliefs about market conditions while still contributing to efficient aggregate outcomes. The London baker, responding to higher wheat prices, may incorrectly attribute the increase to domestic speculation rather than Argentine drought. But his rational response to price signals still contributes to appropriate adjustment throughout the system. Market systems seem to exhibit a form of collective intelligence that emerges from individual actions without requiring individual understanding or wisdom. Consider how this works through a complex contemporary example that tests the limits of price-based coordination. Climate change creates unprecedented risks that markets must somehow price and respond to, but the relevant timescales span decades, while market actors typically focus on much shorter horizons. A coastal real estate developer deciding where to build new housing developments faces immediate market signals about land costs, construction expenses, and buyer demand, but receives no direct price signals about sea level rise risks that may emerge over the next 30 years. Current real estate prices may not adequately reflect climate risks because the relevant information is dispersed, uncertain, and concerns future conditions that current market participants may not fully understand or adequately weigh. This example reveals a fundamental limitation in Smith's analysis of price-based information systems. Prices efficiently aggregate and communicate information that market participants already possess, but they may fail to incorporate information about future risks, environmental externalities, or complex systemic effects that exceed individual market actors' knowledge and planning horizons. The price system works brilliantly for coordinating existing knowledge, but may not generate or communicate new knowledge about problems that transcend individual experience and market timescales. This creates systematic gaps in market information processing that may require non-market institutions to address effectively. The philosophical depth of Smith's insight becomes clearer when we recognize that price-based information systems exhibit what modern theorists call emergent intelligence that cannot be reduced to the intelligence of individual participants. The market system as a whole responds to changing conditions and new information in ways that appear intelligent and adaptive, even though no individual participant possesses the comprehensive knowledge that such intelligence would seem to require. This suggests that social systems can exhibit forms of collective intelligence that transcend individual cognitive limitations, but only under specific institutional conditions that Smith doesn't fully specify. The Argentine wheat example illustrates both the power and the preconditions of price-based coordination. The system works because property rights are secure, contracts are enforceable, transportation networks exist to move wheat internationally, and financial systems allow for payment across borders and currencies. Without this institutional infrastructure, price signals would not transmit effectively, and local shortages would not mobilize resources from distant suppliers. The apparent spontaneity of market coordination thus depends on elaborate legal, financial, and physical infrastructure that markets themselves do not create, but that determines whether price-based information systems can function effectively. More subtly, price-based coordination works only when prices actually reflect the relative social value of different uses for scarce resources. If some market participants have vastly greater purchasing power than others, prices may reflect the preferences of the wealthy rather than broader social priorities about resource allocation. If some costs or benefits are not captured in market prices because they affect third parties or future generations, price signals may guide resources toward privately profitable but socially wasteful uses. The price system's intelligence depends on institutional arrangements that ensure prices accurately reflect social costs and benefits rather than just private costs and benefits to market participants. Smith's analysis points toward a sophisticated understanding of markets as information processing systems that can exhibit remarkable collective intelligence under appropriate institutional conditions, while failing catastrophically when those conditions are absent. The key insight is not that markets are always efficient or that prices always convey accurate information, but that price-based coordination represents a powerful mechanism for social coordination that works when its preconditions are met and requires conscious institutional design to ensure those preconditions are established and maintained. This suggests a more nuanced view of the relationship between markets and government than either pure free market ideology or comprehensive central planning would support. Markets can coordinate complex social activities that would overwhelm any central authority, but only within frameworks of law, regulation, and social institutions that markets alone cannot provide. Part 7. Justice and Beneficence. The moral architecture of society: a merchant refuses to pay his debts despite having adequate resources, violating clear contractual obligations and harming creditors who relied on his promises. Another merchant of equal wealth declines to donate money to hungry orphans, keeping his profits for personal luxury while children suffer from malnutrition. Most people would judge the first merchant more harshly than the second. despite the fact that both actions result in harm to vulnerable people. Smith uses this moral asymmetry to develop a crucial distinction between justice and beneficence that shapes his entire vision of how societies should be organized and what governments should and should not attempt to enforce. The distinction operates through what Smith calls the difference between perfect and imperfect rights. Perfect rights correspond to duties of justice that others can legitimately enforce through punishment or compulsion if necessary. The merchant's creditors have perfect rights to payment according to their contracts, and society may rightfully use legal mechanisms to force compliance or punish non-compliance. Imperfect rights correspond to duties of beneficence that are morally required but cannot rightfully be enforced through external coercion. The hungry orphans have imperfect rights to assistance that make the wealthy merchant's indifference morally blameworthy, but society cannot rightfully force him to provide charity without violating his fundamental liberty. This distinction immediately raises profound questions about the moral boundaries of political authority and the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility. If beneficence is genuinely morally required but not legally enforceable, how do societies ensure adequate provision for vulnerable people who depend on others' voluntary generosity? Conversely, if justice requirements are properly subject to legal enforcement, how do we determine which moral obligations count as matters of justice versus beneficence? The boundary between these categories effectively defines the legitimate scope of government power and the extent of individual moral autonomy. Smith's analysis becomes philosophically sophisticated when we recognize that he doesn't treat this distinction as fixed or obvious, but as requiring careful analysis of the social conditions that make human cooperation possible. Justice includes those moral requirements that are necessary for people to live together in society without constant conflict and mutual harm. Without reliable expectations that contracts will be honoured, property rights respected and persons protected from violence, social cooperation becomes impossible and people retreat into defensive isolation that impoverishes everyone. Justice thus includes the minimal moral requirements that any viable society must enforce, while beneficence includes additional moral ideals that societies may encourage but cannot compel without undermining the freedom that makes moral action meaningful. But this framework confronts immediate challenges when applied to complex contemporary moral problems that Smith could not have anticipated. Consider the moral status of environmental protection in an era of climate change and ecosystem collapse. If current industrial activities impose severe costs on future generations who cannot consent to or compensation for these harms, do we have justice-based obligations to reduce emissions and preserve environmental conditions? Or do environmental concerns represent beneficence-based ideals that are morally praiseworthy but not legitimately enforceable through government regulation? The classification determines whether environmental protection falls within the proper scope of political authority or remains a matter for voluntary individual choice. Smith's framework suggests analysing such cases by examining whether the relevant moral obligations are necessary conditions for viable social cooperation across generations. If climate change threatens social institutions, economic systems, and basic security in ways that undermine future people's capacity for self-governance and social cooperation, then current environmental degradation violates justice rather than merely beneficence. The analysis focuses not on abstract philosophical principles, but on empirical questions about what social conditions are necessary for human cooperation and flourishing over time. This creates a pragmatic approach to determining the boundaries of legitimate government authority that adapts to changing circumstances and new knowledge about social cooperation. The philosophical depth emerges when we recognize that Smith's justice-beneficence distinction reflects a broader theory about the relationship between social institutions and individual moral development. Legal enforcement of justice requirements creates stable social frameworks within which people can pursue their own projects and form voluntary associations without fear of predation or exploitation. But attempts to legally enforce beneficence requirements risk undermining the moral agency and voluntary choice that make genuine virtue possible. Coerced charity is not charity at all, and societies that try to force comprehensive moral behavior may destroy the social conditions within which authentic moral development can occur. This creates a sophisticated account of moral education and social progress that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Legal institutions enforce minimal standards of justice that make social cooperation possible. Cultural institutions, religious organizations, and social norms encourage higher standards of beneficence without coercion. Individual moral development proceeds through voluntary choices within institutional frameworks that provide both security and freedom for moral growth. Social progress occurs through gradual expansion of both justice requirements as social cooperation becomes more complex, and beneficence practices as moral education becomes more effective. The resolution points towards Smith's vision of commercial society as creating institutional conditions favourable to both justice and beneficence without collapsing the distinction between them. Market relationships encourage honesty, reliability, and respect for others' rights because these traits become economically valuable in repeated interactions and reputation-based exchanges. The same commercial relationships generate wealth that makes beneficence more feasible and social connections that make others' needs more visible and emotionally compelling. Commercial society thus tends to strengthen both justice and beneficence, but through different mechanisms that preserve the moral distinction between enforceable obligations and voluntary virtue. This creates space for genuine moral agency within social institutions that provide security and opportunity for moral development while avoiding both anarchic individualism and oppressive collectivism. Part 8. The corrupting effects of wealth, moral challenges of commercial society. A successful merchant accumulates enormous wealth through decades of honest trade, fair dealing, and innovative business practices that benefit thousands of customers and employees. His children inherit this fortune without earning it, growing up surrounded by luxury and deference that shield them from the struggles and disappointments that typically develop moral character. The third generation, further removed from the productive activities that created their wealth, becomes obsessed with social status, conspicuous consumption, and the pursuit of attention and admiration from equally idle peers. Smith observes this pattern repeatedly in commercial societies and identifies it as representing one of wealth's most troubling moral consequences, the tendency of inherited riches to corrupt the very virtues that created them in the first place. The philosophical problem cuts deeper than simple moral disapproval of luxury or privilege. Smith argues that moral development depends crucially on facing genuine challenges, experiencing real consequences for our choices, and receiving honest feedback about our character and behaviour from people whose opinions matter to us. Extreme wealth, especially inherited wealth, can insulate people from all three of these character-forming experiences in ways that prevent normal moral development and encourage what we might call moral infantilism that persists into adulthood. The wealthy person faces few genuine challenges because money can solve most practical problems, experiences few real consequences, because wealth provides extensive buffering against mistake and failure, and receives primarily flattery and deference rather than honest moral feedback, because others seek to benefit from their wealth and status. But Smith's analysis becomes more sophisticated when he recognizes that wealth's corrupting effects operate through social and psychological mechanisms rather than simple material abundance. The problem is not that wealthy people have access to high-quality food, comfortable housing, or excellent healthcare, which are genuine goods that contribute to human flourishing. The problem lies in wealth's tendency to distort social relationships, create artificial social distinctions, and redirect attention from intrinsic to extrinsic values in ways that undermine both individual virtue and social solidarity. Wealth becomes morally problematic when it transforms from a means for achieving worthwhile goals into an end in itself that shapes identity and social relationships. Consider how this analysis applies to contemporary wealth concentration that far exceeds anything Smith could have imagined. A technology entrepreneur becomes worth billions of dollars through creating products that genuinely improve millions of people's lives, representing exactly the kind of productive wealth creation that Smith's economic theory celebrates. But this extraordinary wealth brings social isolation from normal human experiences, constant deference from subordinates and petitioners, and immense power over economic and political institutions that no individual should possess in a democratic society. The same wealth that rewards genuine value creation also creates social and political problems that threaten both individual character development and democratic governance. The moral complexity deepens when we recognize that wealth's corrupting effects operate not only on the wealthy themselves, but on broader social relationships and institutions. Extreme inequality creates what Smith calls emulation effects, where people throughout society orient their behavior around gaining the admiration and approval of the wealthy, rather than pursuing intrinsic goods like meaningful work, strong relationships, or moral virtue. Social institutions begin to cater primarily to wealthy interests, political systems become responsive mainly to wealthy donors, and cultural values shift towards celebrating wealth acquisition over other forms of human achievement. The corruption thus spreads beyond the wealthy to affect society's entire moral and political structure. Smith's analysis reveals a fundamental tension within commercial society between wealth creation and virtue development that cannot be easily resolved. Commercial society depends on people pursuing profit and accumulating wealth as incentives for productive activity that benefits everyone through job creation, innovation, and economic growth. But the same wealth accumulation that drives economic progress can undermine the moral virtues and social relationships that make commercial society attractive in the first place. Successful commercial societies thus face an ongoing challenge of maintaining incentives for productive wealth creation, while preventing wealth concentration from corrupting individual character and social institutions. The philosophical depth appears when Smith connects this analysis to his broader theory of moral development and social progress. He argues that moral virtue develops through what we might call moral exercise, facing challenges that require us to balance competing considerations, make difficult choices with uncertain outcomes, and learn from the consequences of our decisions. Wealth can eliminate these opportunities for moral exercise by making choices too easy, consequences too minimal, and feedback too distorted to support genuine character development. But poverty can also prevent moral development by creating such desperate circumstances that people have no opportunity to develop virtues beyond mere survival. This suggests that moral development requires what we might call a moral middle class of people who face genuine challenges and choices, but possess sufficient resources and security to develop virtues beyond immediate self-preservation. Commercial society's moral health depends on maintaining broad-based prosperity that provides most people with opportunities for moral development, while preventing wealth concentration from creating a separate class insulated from normal moral challenges. This requires ongoing attention to economic policies, social institutions, and cultural practices that promote productive wealth creation, while ensuring that wealth serves human development rather than corrupting it. Smith's solution involves a combination of institutional design and cultural education that acknowledges wealth's legitimate role while constraining its corrupting potential. Progressive taxation can prevent excessive wealth concentration while preserving incentives for productive activity. Educational institutions can cultivate values that emphasize intrinsic goods like knowledge, virtue and service rather than merely wealth and status. Social norms can celebrate productive achievement while discouraging conspicuous consumption and status competition. Political institutions can limit wealth's influence over democratic governance while protecting property rights and economic freedom. The goal is not to eliminate wealth or commercial activity, but to embed them within social frameworks that channel wealth toward human flourishing rather than human corruption. Part 9. Education and Moral Formation: Cultivating Citizens in Commercial Society. A young person growing up in a commercial society faces a fundamentally different moral education than their counterparts in traditional agricultural or aristocratic communities. Instead of learning a comprehensive way of life from family and community elders who share similar experiences and values, they must navigate competing influences from market relationships, formal schooling, mass media, and peer cultures that often transmit contradictory messages about what matters in life. Smith recognizes this as both an opportunity and a crisis. Commercial societies can provide broader educational opportunities and greater individual freedom to develop according to personal talents and inclinations, but they can also fragment moral education in ways that leave people without coherent guidance for living well. The question becomes how commercial societies can cultivate the virtues and capabilities that their own success requires without reverting to the rigid traditional structures that commercial development has rightly transcended. Smith's analysis begins with recognizing that commercial society creates novel educational needs that traditional moral education cannot address. In traditional societies, people typically followed occupations similar to their parents, lived in stable communities with shared values, and faced moral dilemmas within well-established frameworks that provided clear guidance about appropriate behavior. Commercial societies require people to adapt to rapidly changing economic conditions, interact with diverse others whose values and backgrounds differ dramatically from their own, and make moral decisions in novel situations without clear precedent or universal agreement about appropriate responses. Traditional moral education based on memorizing fixed rules and imitating established authorities becomes inadequate for preparing people to flourish in such dynamic and diverse environments. The challenge becomes particularly acute when we consider the specific moral demands that commercial society places on individuals. Success in market relationships requires trustworthiness, but also competitive drive, cooperation with others, but also individual initiative, respect for rules and contracts, but also innovation and creative rule-breaking, concern for others' welfare, but also self-reliance and personal responsibility. These requirements often create tensions that traditional virtue ethics, focused on harmonious character development, does not adequately address. Commercial society seems to require people who can balance competing values and shift between different moral frameworks depending on context rather than simply embodying consistent virtuous traits across all situations. Smith's solution involves what we might call sympathetic education that develops people's capacity for moral imagination, rather than simply transmitting fixed moral rules. The goal is to cultivate the ability to understand different perspectives, imagine how actions affect various stakeholders, and reason about moral principles that can guide behavior across diverse situations. This requires educational approaches that expose students to literature, history, and philosophy that expand their sympathetic capacities, along with practical experiences that require them to consider others' viewpoints and negotiate moral conflicts through discussion and debate. Moral education becomes less about learning the right answers to predetermined questions and more about developing skills for analyzing novel moral problems and reaching reasoned conclusions through sympathetic engagement with competing perspectives. But this educational approach immediately confronts what we might call the relativism problem that threatens to undermine moral education entirely. If moral education focuses on understanding multiple perspectives rather than learning correct values, how do students develop firm moral commitments rather than cynical relativism that sees all moral positions as equally arbitrary? A contemporary example illustrates this challenge. Students studying historical debates about slavery might learn to understand both pro-slavery and abolitionist arguments from their respective historical contexts, but such understanding could lead either to stronger moral conviction against slavery or to relativistic conclusions that moral judgments are merely cultural artifacts with no objective validity. Sympathetic education risks producing moral sophistication that undermines rather than strengthens moral commitment. Smith's response reveals the philosophical sophistication of his educational theory. He argues that genuine sympathetic engagement with different perspectives actually strengthens rather than weakens moral conviction by helping people understand which moral principles can withstand scrutiny from multiple viewpoints and which represent mere prejudice or self-interest. The student who understands pro-slavery arguments thoroughly may initially feel uncertain about moral judgments, but this uncertainty leads to deeper investigation that ultimately reveals the moral and empirical weaknesses in pro-slavery positions. Sympathetic education produces stronger moral convictions because those convictions are based on more complete understanding rather than ignorant prejudice. But the process requires intellectual courage and patience that traditional moral education often discourages. The analysis becomes more complex when applied to contemporary educational challenges that Smith could not have anticipated. Modern commercial societies require citizens capable of making informed decisions about complex technical issues like climate policy, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence that exceed any individual's expert knowledge but require collective democratic deliberation. Traditional civic education focused on constitutional principles and political procedures becomes inadequate when democratic governance requires citizens to evaluate competing expert claims about technical matters that nonetheless involve fundamental moral and political values. Sympathetic education must somehow prepare people to engage responsibly with technical expertise while maintaining democratic accountability and moral agency in domains where technical and moral considerations interact in complex ways. Smith's vision points toward educational institutions that balance several potentially conflicting goals simultaneously. They must develop technical knowledge and specialized skills required for economic productivity, while maintaining broad intellectual capabilities necessary for civic participation. They must cultivate individual talents and autonomous judgment, while fostering social virtues and cooperative capabilities required for community life. They must prepare people for rapid economic and technological change, while transmitting moral wisdom and cultural knowledge that provide stability and continuity across generations. They must encourage critical thinking and intellectual independence, while building shared commitments to democratic values and social cooperation. The resolution involves recognizing that moral education in commercial societies must be lifelong and multi-institutional rather than confined to formal schooling during childhood and adolescence. Families, schools, religious organizations, workplace relationships, civic associations, and cultural institutions all contribute to ongoing moral development in ways that can either reinforce or undermine each other. The challenge becomes creating coordination among these institutions that supports coherent moral development, without imposing rigid uniformity that stifles individual growth and social innovation. This requires conscious attention to how different institutions can complement each other in fostering the moral capabilities that commercial society requires, while preserving the diversity and freedom that make such societies attractive. Part 10. Religion and Natural Theology. The divine foundation of moral order. A clockmaker designs an intricate timepiece with hundreds of precisely calibrated parts that work together to measure time accurately over many years. The clock's complexity and functionality provide evidence of intelligent design that even someone who never met the clockmaker could recognize and appreciate. Smith uses this analogy, common in 18th century thought, to argue that the natural world's intricate organization and apparent design for promoting human welfare provide evidence for divine intelligence governing the universe. But his analysis of natural theology reveals sophisticated tensions between religious faith and empirical observation that anticipate many contemporary debates about the relationship between science and religion in understanding moral order. Smith's approach to religious questions reflects his broader philosophical method of grounding abstract principles in concrete human experience, rather than appealing to pure reason or revealed authority. He argues that people naturally develop religious sentiments through observing the natural world's beauty and complexity, experiencing moral obligations that seem to transcend human convention, and feeling gratitude for life's goods that appears directed towards some ultimate source of beneficence. These religious sentiments arise spontaneously from human nature rather than being imposed through external indoctrination, which suggests they serve important functions in human psychological and moral development. But the same empirical approach that supports religious sentiments also raises questions about traditional religious doctrines that conflict with careful observation of natural and social phenomena. The philosophical tension emerges most clearly in Smith's analysis of the problem of evil that challenges any simple identification of natural processes with divine benevolence. If the universe is designed by benevolent intelligence to promote human welfare, how do we account for natural disasters, diseases, predation, and the vast amounts of suffering that characterize both human history and natural processes generally? A contemporary example illustrates the challenge. Genetic diseases affect children who have done nothing to deserve suffering. Natural disasters destroy communities without regard to their moral character, and evolutionary processes operate through competition and death that seem inconsistent with any benevolent design. The evidence that initially supports natural theology also raises serious questions about the moral character of any designer responsible for natural processes that generate immense suffering alongside their beneficial effects. Smith's response involves what we might call a limited naturalism that acknowledges both the evidence for intelligent design and the limits of human understanding about ultimate purposes. He argues that natural processes exhibit sufficient order and beneficial tendencies to justify belief in divine intelligence, but human beings cannot fully comprehend the ultimate purposes that such intelligence might serve. What appears as meaningless suffering from limited human perspectives might serve functions within larger systems of purpose that exceed human understanding, just as individual parts of a complex machine might seem pointless until we understand their role in the machine's overall function. This preserves religious faith, while acknowledging the genuine intellectual challenges that empirical observation raises for simple optimistic theology. But this solution creates new philosophical problems about the relationship between religious faith and moral action. If we cannot understand ultimate divine purposes, how can we use religious beliefs to guide moral behavior in specific situations? The pharmaceutical executive facing pricing decisions about life-saving medicines might believe that God ultimately governs economic processes, but this belief provides no clear guidance about whether divine purposes favor maximizing access to treatment or preserving incentives for medical innovation. Religious faith that acknowledges the limits of human understanding about divine purposes may provide psychological comfort and general moral orientation, but cannot resolve specific moral dilemmas without additional premises that faith alone cannot establish. Smith's analysis becomes more sophisticated when he examines the social functions of religious institutions rather than focusing solely on abstract theological questions. He argues that religious organizations serve crucial roles in moral education, community building, and providing support for people facing life's inevitable difficulties and tragedies. Religious practices like worship, prayer, and communal celebration cultivate moral sentiments, create social bonds, and offer meaning and purpose that pure philosophical reasoning cannot provide for most people. Even if specific religious doctrines cannot be rationally demonstrated, religious institutions may serve human needs that secular alternatives cannot adequately address. This functional analysis reveals both the benefits and dangers of organized religion in commercial societies. Religious institutions can provide moral guidance and social solidarity that markets alone cannot generate, offering alternatives to purely materialistic values and competitive individualism that commercial relationships might otherwise encourage. But religious organizations can also become sources of dogmatism, social division, and political oppression when they claim authority over domains where human reason and experience provide better guidance than religious tradition. The challenge becomes maintaining religious institutions' beneficial social functions, while preventing them from undermining the intellectual freedom and tolerance that commercial societies require for continued progress and peaceful cooperation among people with different religious beliefs. Smith's solution involves what we might call civil religion, that combines genuine religious sentiment with intellectual modesty about ultimate theological questions. People can maintain religious faith and participate in religious communities while recognizing that specific religious doctrines remain matters of personal conviction rather than publicly demonstrable truth. This allows religious institutions to contribute to moral education and social solidarity without claiming authority to resolve political disputes or suppress intellectual inquiry. Religious freedom thus becomes not merely a political compromise, but a recognition that religious truth cannot be established through coercion. and that social cooperation requires respecting differences in ultimate beliefs while maintaining shared commitments to justice and mutual respect. The resolution points towards Smith's broader vision of how different sources of moral guidance can complement each other in complex societies. Religious institutions provide meaning, community, and moral inspiration that purely secular institutions cannot adequately supply. Philosophical reasoning offers critical analysis and general principles that religious tradition alone cannot establish. Empirical observation provides knowledge about natural and social processes that both religious and philosophical speculation must respect. Political institutions create frameworks for peaceful cooperation among people with different religious and philosophical commitments. The goal is not to eliminate religious differences or subordinate religion to secular authority, but to create social conditions within which different approaches to ultimate questions can coexist productively while contributing to human flourishing and social cooperation. Part 11. The proper functions of government. Beyond night watchman state. A government official must decide whether the state should fund the construction of roads, bridges and canals that would facilitate commerce but require taxation that reduces private spending and investment. Classical liberal theory might suggest that government should limit itself to protecting property rights and enforcing contracts, leaving all productive activities to private initiative. But Smith's analysis reveals a more nuanced understanding of government's proper role that goes well beyond the minimal night watchman state, while avoiding the comprehensive central planning that would undermine market mechanisms. His theory of public goods and government functions anticipates many contemporary debates about the proper scope of state activity in market economies. Smith identifies three primary functions of government that even the most market-oriented society cannot avoid. First, defense against foreign aggression requires collective action and public funding because individual citizens cannot effectively organize military resistance on their own, and the benefits of national defense cannot be limited to those who pay for it. Second, administration of justice through courts, police and legal systems provides the institutional framework within which market relationships can function reliably. Third, public works and institutions that benefit society generally but cannot profitably be undertaken by private parties require government initiative because their benefits are too dispersed and long-term to attract private investment despite their genuine social value. The philosophical complexity begins with the third function, which Smith calls erecting and maintaining those public works and those public institutions which, though they may be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are, however, of such a nature that the profit could never repay the expense to any individual. This creates immediate questions about how to identify genuine public goods versus private interests seeking subsidies, and how to ensure that government provision of public goods enhances rather than undermines private initiative and market coordination. Consider how this analysis applies to contemporary infrastructure investment that Smith could not have imagined, but his framework can illuminate. High-speed internet networks require enormous upfront investments, create benefits that extend far beyond direct users, and enable economic activities that would otherwise be impossible. Private companies might build networks in profitable urban areas while neglecting rural regions where costs are higher and potential revenues lower, creating systematic gaps in coverage that limit overall economic development. Government investment could ensure comprehensive coverage that enables broader economic growth, but it might also crowd out private investment, create inefficient political allocation of resources, and establish precedents for government involvement in areas where market solutions would work better. Smith's framework suggests analysing such cases by examining whether market failures are genuine and systematic rather than temporary or easily correctable through institutional reforms. If network effects, coordination problems, or genuine public goods characteristics prevent efficient private provision, then government action may be justified despite its costs and risks. But government intervention should aim to address specific market failures while preserving competitive incentives and private initiative wherever possible, rather than replacing market mechanisms entirely. This might involve government funding combined with private construction and operation, or temporary government investment designed to establish infrastructure that private actors can subsequently maintain and expand. The analysis becomes more complex when we consider Smith's recognition that government itself can become a source of economic inefficiency and political oppression. Government officials face different incentives than private market participants and may pursue personal or political interests that conflict with efficient resource allocation and genuine public benefit. Special interest groups may capture regulatory processes and redirect government power toward private advantage rather than public good, creating what modern economists call rent-seeking that wastes resources while enriching politically connected individuals and groups. The same government power needed to address market failures can become a source of economic distortion and social injustice if not carefully constrained and properly directed. This creates what we might call the institutional design problem that runs throughout Smith's political economy. Government must be powerful enough to provide essential public goods, maintain justice systems and correct serious market failures, but constrained enough to prevent abuse of power, rent-seeking and the destruction of beneficial market processes. The solution requires sophisticated institutional arrangements that align government incentives with public benefit while providing mechanisms for accountability and limitation of power. This involves not just constitutional constraints on government authority, but also competitive federalism, separation of powers, transparent decision-making processes, and ongoing public scrutiny of government performance. Smith's analysis of taxation reveals similar tensions between necessary government functions and the economic costs of funding those functions. All taxes create some economic distortions by affecting the relative prices and incentives that guide private decision-making, potentially discouraging productive activities and encouraging wasteful tax avoidance efforts. But government services require funding, and the alternative of voluntary contributions would likely lead to systematic underprovision of public goods as individuals free-ride on others' contributions. The challenge becomes designing tax systems that raise necessary revenue while minimizing economic distortions and maintaining political legitimacy through perceived fairness in tax burdens. Smith's 4 maxims of taxation provide principles for addressing these trade-offs. Taxes should be proportional to ability to pay, certain rather than arbitrary, convenient for taxpayers to pay, and economical to collect. These principles balance efficiency considerations with concerns about distributive justice and political sustainability, recognizing that tax systems must be not only economically sound, but also politically acceptable to citizens who ultimately decide whether to comply with or resist tax obligations. Modern tax policy continues to struggle with these same tensions, particularly as globalization makes it easier for mobile capital and skilled workers to avoid high tax jurisdictions, while creating demands for government services that require substantial public funding. The resolution points towards Smith's vision of limited but effective government that takes seriously both market capabilities and market limitations. Government should focus on functions that markets cannot perform effectively, while relying on market mechanisms wherever possible to achieve social goals efficiently and preserve individual freedom. This requires ongoing empirical analysis of which functions markets can perform well under different institutional conditions, rather than ideological commitments to either minimal government or comprehensive state control. The goal is institutional arrangements that combine market coordination with public provision in ways that maximize human flourishing, while minimizing both market failures and government failures that reduce overall social welfare. Part 12. Free Trade and National Prosperity. Beyond mercantile delusions. A French vineyard produces excellent wine at lower cost than English vineyards can achieve, while English wool manufacturers create superior cloth more efficiently than French textile producers. Mercantilist economic theory dominant in Smith's era would suggest that each country should protect its domestic industries from foreign competition to preserve jobs and prevent gold and silver from flowing to rival nations. But Smith's analysis reveals this reasoning as fundamentally misguided, showing how international specialization and voluntary exchange can benefit all participating countries simultaneously without requiring anyone to sacrifice prosperity for others' gain. His theory of international trade provides one of the clearest examples of how individual self-interest can produce beneficial social outcomes through spontaneous coordination rather than central planning. The philosophical foundation of Smith's trade theory rests on extending his analysis of the division of labour from individual workshops to entire nations and global economic relationships. Just as individual workers become more productive by specializing in particular tasks and exchanging their products, entire countries can increase their collective wealth by specializing in industries where they possess comparative advantages and trading with other nations for goods that would be more expensive to produce domestically. The French vineyard owner and English wool manufacturer both benefit when France exports wine to England and imports English cloth, because each country can obtain desired goods at lower cost than domestic production would require. International trade thus represents voluntary cooperation that increases total wealth available to all participants, rather than zero-sum competition where one country's gain requires another's loss. But Smith's free trade argument confronts immediate objections that remain influential in contemporary policy debates. Critics argue that international competition destroys domestic jobs, undermines national security by creating dependence on foreign suppliers, and benefits only wealthy merchants and consumers while harming workers in competing industries. A contemporary example illustrates these concerns. When manufacturing jobs move from high-wage countries to regions with lower labour costs, the resulting unemployment and community disruption can devastate entire regions even if overall economic efficiency increases and consumer prices decrease. Free trade's aggregate benefits may not compensate for its concentrated costs, creating political pressures for protection that Smith's abstract analysis doesn't adequately address. Smith's response reveals the sophisticated political economy underlying his free trade advocacy. He recognizes that international competition does eliminate some domestic jobs and can cause genuine hardship for workers whose skills become less valuable in global markets. But he argues that protectionist policies designed to preserve existing jobs ultimately reduce overall prosperity by forcing consumers to pay higher prices for inferior goods while preventing resources from moving to more productive uses. The proper response to trade-related displacement involves facilitating adjustment to new economic conditions, rather than preventing beneficial change through protective barriers that make everyone worse off in the long run. The philosophical depth emerges when we recognize that Smith's trade theory challenges fundamental assumptions about national identity, economic solidarity, and political obligation. Mercantilist thinking assumes that countries are naturally in economic competition with each other, making one nation's prosperity a threat to others' welfare, and justifying protective policies that preserve domestic advantages even at the cost of global efficiency. Smith's analysis suggests that countries have shared interests in mutual prosperity that transcend national boundaries, and that policies designed to benefit domestic producers at foreign competitors' expense typically harm domestic consumers more than they help domestic producers. This creates tension between economic logic and political sentiment about national solidarity and mutual obligation among fellow citizens. Consider how this tension plays out in contemporary debates about globalization and economic nationalism. When multinational corporations move production facilities to countries with lower labor costs, they may reduce employment in their home countries while providing jobs and economic development in poorer regions of the world. Smith's analysis suggests that such moves benefit global welfare by allowing production to occur where it can be accomplished most efficiently, while reducing prices for consumers everywhere and creating economic opportunities in developing countries. But citizens whose jobs are eliminated may reasonably ask why they should sacrifice their economic security for the benefit of foreign workers and distant consumers, especially if their own government provides inadequate assistance for economic transition and adjustment. Smith's framework suggests that the solution involves not restricting beneficial trade, but improving domestic institutions for managing economic change and assisting displaced workers. Countries that benefit from international trade should invest in education, infrastructure, and social insurance systems that help workers adapt to changing economic conditions rather than trying to prevent change through protectionist policies. This requires recognizing that free trade's benefits are real, but not automatically distributed, in ways that compensate those who bear its costs, making complementary policies necessary to ensure that trade liberalization serves broad-based prosperity rather than narrow interests. The goal is capturing trade's efficiency gains while addressing its distributive consequences through domestic policy reform rather than international trade restriction. The analysis becomes more complex when applied to contemporary global trade relationships that involve vast differences in labour standards, environmental regulations, and political systems. Smith's 18th-century trade examples involved countries with roughly similar institutions and development levels, making voluntary exchange relationships relatively straightforward to evaluate. Modern global trade often involves countries with dramatically different regulatory environments, creating questions about whether apparent comparative advantages reflect genuine efficiency differences or systematic exploitation of workers and environmental resources that would be illegal in more regulated economies. Free trade principles may need modification when trading partners have fundamentally different approaches to labour rights, environmental protection, and political freedom that affect the true social costs of production. Smith's broader institutional analysis provides guidance for addressing these contemporary challenges. He emphasizes that beneficial market relationships depend on appropriate legal frameworks, genuine competition, and institutions that ensure prices reflect true social costs and benefits. International trade relationships that involve systematic exploitation or environmental destruction violate these conditions and may justify trade policies that encourage better labour and environmental standards in trading partners. But such policies should aim to extend beneficial institutions globally rather than protecting inefficient domestic industries from legitimate competition, maintaining Smith's core insight that voluntary exchange benefits all participants when conducted within appropriate institutional frameworks. The resolution points towards Smith's vision of international economic relationships as potentially serving human flourishing globally, while requiring conscious attention to institutional design and policy coordination. Free trade represents a powerful mechanism for increasing global prosperity and creating incentives for peaceful cooperation among nations with different political systems and cultural traditions. But realizing these benefits requires domestic institutions that help citizens adapt to economic change and international institutions that ensure trade occurs within frameworks that protect basic human rights and environmental sustainability. The goal is extending the benefits of commercial society globally while addressing the legitimate concerns that motivate resistance to economic globalization. Part 13. The Stages of Social Development, from Hunters to Commerce. A hunter-gatherer society operates with minimal property distinctions, informal leadership structures, and simple moral codes based on reciprocity and kinship obligations. Over centuries, this society gradually develops agriculture, which creates permanent settlements, private land ownership, social hierarchies based on wealth differences, and complex legal systems to resolve property disputes. Eventually, manufacturing and commerce emerge, creating urban centres, elaborate financial institutions and social relationships based on voluntary exchange rather than traditional authority or family connections. Smith identifies this progression as representing a natural sequence of social development that shapes not only economic relationships, but also political institutions, moral attitudes, and individual psychology in ways that explain the differences between traditional and commercial societies. Smith's four-stage theory of social development provides a framework for understanding how economic conditions shape broader social institutions and cultural values. Each stage creates different relationships between individuals and property, different forms of social organization, and different moral and political challenges that societies must address to maintain social cooperation. The hunting stage involves minimal private property and egalitarian social relationships, but also limits population size and provides little security against natural disasters or resource scarcity. The pastoral stage introduces private property and livestock and creates wealth differences that require governance institutions to resolve conflicts, but remains vulnerable to migration pressures and military conquest. The agricultural stage establishes permanent settlements and complex property relationships, but creates rigid social hierarchies and limits individual mobility and opportunity. The commercial stage generates unprecedented wealth and individual freedom, but also creates new forms of inequality and social fragmentation that require sophisticated institutional responses. The philosophical significance of this developmental framework extends beyond historical description to fundamental questions about human nature, social progress, and moral evaluation. Smith suggests that human beings are naturally adaptive creatures whose moral sentiments, political institutions, and social relationships evolve in response to changing material conditions rather than reflecting fixed characteristics that remain constant across all societies. This implies that moral and political principles that work well in one social stage may become inappropriate or even harmful when applied to societies at different developmental levels. The egalitarian values appropriate to hunter-gatherer societies might undermine the productivity and innovation that commercial societies require, while commercial societies' emphasis on individual achievement and voluntary exchange might prove inadequate for societies facing existential threats that require collective mobilization and traditional authority structures. But this framework immediately raises troubling questions about moral relativism and cultural imperialism that Smith does not fully resolve. If different social stages require different moral and political arrangements, how can we evaluate whether particular societies are developing in beneficial directions or making moral progress versus merely changing in response to altered circumstances? A contemporary example illustrates the challenge. When traditional societies encounter commercial relationships through global trade and development programs, they may experience both beneficial opportunities for increased prosperity and harmful disruption of traditional social bonds and cultural values. Smith's developmental framework could justify either celebrating such changes as representing progress towards more advanced social forms, or criticizing them as destroying valuable traditional arrangements that served important human needs. Smith's resolution involves distinguishing between arbitrary cultural differences and genuine improvements in human welfare that can be evaluated across different social contexts. He argues that later developmental stages generally provide better opportunities for human flourishing through increased security, greater individual freedom, and more extensive cooperation that allows people to develop their talents and pursue their chosen goals. But he also recognizes that each stage involves trade-offs and that commercial society creates new problems alongside its benefits, making social development a complex process of gains and losses rather than simple linear progress. The evaluation focuses on whether changes increase overall opportunities for human development, while acknowledging that different individuals and groups may benefit or suffer differently from social transitions. The analysis becomes more sophisticated when applied to contemporary development challenges that involve rapid transitions between social stages within compressed time periods. Traditional societies encountering modern technology, global markets, and democratic political systems may experience the benefits and disruptions of multiple developmental stages simultaneously, rather than through gradual evolution over centuries. This can create social fragmentation, cultural confusion, and political instability as different groups within the same society adapt at different rates to new economic opportunities and social relationships. Smith's framework suggests that successful development requires institutional arrangements that facilitate beneficial change, while providing continuity and stability for people whose lives are disrupted by rapid social transformation. The deeper philosophical insight concerns the relationship between economic development and moral development that runs throughout Smith's analysis. He argues that commercial societies tend to develop more refined moral sentiments, more sophisticated moral reasoning, and more extensive concern for distant others, because commercial relationships require trust, honesty, and consideration for others' interests in ways that earlier social stages do not. The merchant who cheats customers or breaks contracts will lose reputation and business, creating incentives for moral behavior that operate through self-interest rather than requiring purely altruistic motivation. But the same commercial relationships may also encourage materialism, competitiveness, and social fragmentation that undermine traditional virtues like loyalty, courage, and community solidarity that earlier social stages cultivated more effectively. This creates what we might call the moral development paradox of social progress. Later developmental stages may cultivate some moral capacities while weakening others, making overall moral evaluation of social change complex and contested. Commercial societies may produce people who are more tolerant, peaceful, and concerned with others' welfare in economic relationships, while being less capable of heroic self-sacrifice, martial virtue, and deep community engagement that traditional societies required and rewarded. The question becomes whether these trade-offs represent genuine moral progress or merely different adaptations to different social circumstances that cannot be ranked hierarchically. Smith's analysis suggests that social development creates new possibilities for moral development that build on rather than simply replacing earlier moral achievements. Commercial societies can cultivate traditional virtues through new institutional arrangements. Military service can preserve courage and patriotism, civic associations can maintain community solidarity, and religious institutions can foster self-sacrifice and spiritual development within contexts shaped by commercial freedom and prosperity. The goal is not preserving traditional social arrangements unchanged, but adapting valuable traditional insights to new social conditions while taking advantage of new opportunities for human flourishing that social development creates. This requires conscious institutional design and cultural cultivation rather than simply allowing market forces and technological change to determine social evolution without reference to broader human values and moral considerations. Part 14. Sympathy and Social Distance. The expanding circle of moral concern. A person feels intense grief when their pet dies, moderate concern when reading about a neighbour's job loss, and minimal emotional response to news reports about famine affecting thousands of people in distant countries. This natural variation in sympathetic response based on proximity and familiarity creates what Smith recognizes as one of the fundamental challenges for moral development. How to extend moral concern beyond immediate personal relationships to include distant others whose welfare should matter morally, even when it doesn't generate strong emotional responses. His analysis of this problem anticipates contemporary debates about global justice, humanitarian intervention, and the psychological obstacles to effective altruism that prevent people from responding appropriately to distant suffering despite intellectual recognition of its moral significance. Smith's investigation of sympathy's limitations reveals sophisticated insights about the relationship between emotion and moral judgment that challenge both purely rationalist and purely emotivist approaches to ethics. Moral judgment requires emotional engagement to motivate action and provide concrete understanding of how our choices affect others' welfare. But emotional responses naturally fade with physical, social, and temporal distance in ways that create systematic biases in moral attention. The challenge becomes developing moral reasoning capabilities that can extend sympathetic insights beyond sympathy's natural range without losing the motivational force and concrete understanding that make sympathetic responses valuable for moral guidance in the first place. This requires what we might call educated sympathy, that combines natural emotional responses with reflective analysis and institutional arrangements that make distant others' welfare more visible and emotionally compelling. The philosophical complexity emerges when we recognize that expanding moral concern faces not only psychological but also practical limitations that Smith's analysis doesn't fully address. If we attempted to feel equally strongly about all human suffering regardless of distance, we might become paralyzed by the vastness of global misery or spread our attention so thin as to be ineffective in helping anyone. Moreover, we have special obligations to family members, friends and fellow citizens that justify some partiality in moral attention and resource allocation, even from impartial moral perspectives. The question becomes how to distinguish appropriate limitations on moral concern from mere selfishness or prejudice, and how to balance legitimate partiality with genuine obligations to distant others whose welfare we can significantly affect through our choices. Consider how this analysis applies to contemporary global challenges that require individual moral response to distant suffering. Effective altruism movements argue that people in wealthy countries should donate significant portions of their income to organizations addressing global poverty, preventable diseases, and other problems where relatively small donations can dramatically improve or save lives. Smith's framework suggests that such obligations are genuine because we can sympathize with distant others' suffering when we make the imaginative effort to understand their experiences, and the impartial spectator would approve of helping when we can do so at relatively modest cost to ourselves. But the same framework acknowledges that natural sympathetic responses provide stronger motivation for helping local causes where we can see direct results and maintain ongoing relationships with beneficiaries. Smith's solution involves developing what we might call institutional sympathy, that extends individual moral concern through social arrangements rather than relying solely on individual emotional responses to motivate appropriate action. Religious organizations, humanitarian groups, and educational institutions can make distant suffering more visible and emotionally compelling through storytelling, personal testimonies, and direct experience programs that help people connect emotionally with distant others. Government foreign aid programs and international institutions can create systematic responses to global problems that don't depend on fluctuating individual charitable impulses but reflect collective commitments to helping distant others in need. Media institutions can provide information about distant suffering and connect individual choices to global consequences in ways that make moral obligations to distant others more concrete and actionable. But institutional approaches to extending moral concern create new problems about paternalism, cultural imperialism, and the relationship between individual moral agency and collective moral action. When institutions mediate our relationships with distant others, we may lose direct understanding of their actual needs and preferences while substituting our own cultural assumptions about what kinds of help would be most beneficial. International aid programs may reflect donors' values and interests more than recipients' actual priorities, creating dependency relationships that undermine recipients' autonomy and self-determination. The same institutional arrangements that extend moral concern beyond individual limitations may distort moral understanding and create new forms of domination that substitute for, rather than complement, appropriate individual moral response. Smith's analysis suggests that the solution involves combining individual moral development with institutional arrangements that enhance rather than replace individual moral agency. Effective institutions for extending moral concern should provide information, create opportunities for meaningful engagement, and facilitate individual choices about how to respond to distant others' needs, rather than substituting institutional responses for individual moral deliberation. This might involve supporting organizations that provide direct communication between donors and beneficiaries, creating exchange programs that allow people to experience different social conditions personally, and developing educational approaches that cultivate sympathetic imagination through literature, history, and cross-cultural studies. The goal is expanding individual moral capabilities rather than creating institutional systems that make individual moral engagement unnecessary. The deeper philosophical insight concerns the relationship between moral progress and social complexity that runs throughout Smith's analysis of commercial society. More complex societies create both greater opportunities and greater obstacles for moral development as they multiply human relationships, while making many of those relationships indirect and abstract. Commercial societies may cultivate more extensive moral concern because they create economic relationships that connect people across vast distances and cultural differences. But they may also encourage moral superficiality because most relationships become instrumental and temporary rather than deep and enduring. Moral progress requires taking advantage of expanded opportunities for moral concern while preserving the depth and intensity of moral engagement that simpler societies could achieve within their more limited moral circles. The resolution points towards Smith's vision of moral education and institutional design that gradually expands moral concern while maintaining its effectiveness and authenticity. This involves neither abandoning partiality for abstract universalism nor accepting partiality as justifying indifference to distant others, but developing sophisticated approaches to moral reasoning that can balance competing obligations and extend sympathetic understanding systematically rather than merely episodically. Commercial society provides both the resources and the incentives for such moral development, but realizing its potential requires conscious cultivation of moral capabilities that markets alone will not automatically generate. The expanding circle of moral concern represents a possibility rather than an inevitability of social development that requires individual effort and institutional support to achieve effectively. Part 15. The theory of moral sentiments meets the wealth of nations. Reconciling ethics and economics. A charitable foundation must decide whether to provide direct cash transfers to extremely poor families or to invest the same money in job training programs that might generate higher long-term returns but help fewer people immediately. The foundation's trustees feel stronger sympathetic responses toward families facing immediate hunger and homelessness. But economic analysis suggests that skills training would create more sustainable improvements in welfare over time. This scenario illustrates a fundamental tension that scholars have identified between Smith's ethical theory, which emphasizes sympathetic responses and moral sentiments, and his economic theory, which celebrates self-interest and market mechanisms. The relationship between these two major works has generated centuries of debate about whether Smith maintained a consistent philosophical position or developed contradictory theories that cannot be reconciled without abandoning key insights from one or both approaches. The apparent contradiction operates on multiple levels that create different challenges for interpretation. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith emphasizes that moral judgment depends on sympathetic identification with others, and that virtue consists in acting according to sentiments that an impartial spectator would approve. In The Wealth of Nations, he argues that individual pursuit of self-interest generally produces better social outcomes than conscious attempts at beneficence, suggesting that virtue and social welfare may actually conflict in market contexts. The charitable foundation example illustrates this tension. Sympathetic responses favor immediate relief that addresses visible suffering, while economic reasoning favors longer-term investments that may prevent more suffering but provide less immediate sympathetic satisfaction for donors. But Smith's actual analysis proves more sophisticated than this apparent contradiction suggests when we examine how both works understand the relationship between individual motivation and social consequences. The theory of moral sentiments never argues that sympathetic responses alone provide adequate guidance for complex moral decisions, but emphasizes that moral judgment requires reflective analysis through the impartial spectator mechanism that can correct for biases in immediate sympathetic responses. Similarly, The Wealth of Nations never celebrates pure selfishness, but analyzes how institutional arrangements can channel self-interested behavior toward socially beneficial outcomes while recognizing that such arrangements require moral and political foundations that self-interest alone cannot provide. Both works share a concern with understanding how individual psychology and social institutions interact to promote or hinder human flourishing. The philosophical unity emerges when we recognize that both works address the same fundamental problem: how to design social institutions that work effectively given human nature as it actually is, rather than as we might wish it to be. The theory of moral sentiments analyzes moral psychology to understand how people actually make moral judgments and what kinds of institutional arrangements can cultivate better moral development. The Wealth of Nations analyzes economic psychology to understand how people actually make economic decisions and what kinds of institutional arrangements can channel those decisions toward beneficial social outcomes. Both approaches assume that successful institutions must work with, rather than against, natural human tendencies, while providing frameworks that encourage the development of beneficial tendencies and discourage harmful ones. Consider how this integrated approach applies to contemporary corporate social responsibility initiatives that attempt to combine profit-seeking with social benefit. Companies increasingly face pressure to consider environmental sustainability, worker welfare, and community development alongside financial returns, creating questions about whether such initiatives represent genuine moral progress or merely sophisticated marketing strategies. Smith's framework suggests analyzing such cases by examining whether corporate social responsibility practices emerge from institutional arrangements that genuinely align profit incentives with social benefit, or merely create appearance of moral behavior while preserving fundamentally extractive business models. The key question is not whether corporate executives have virtuous motives, but whether the institutional context creates reliable incentives for beneficial behavior, regardless of individual motivation. This analysis reveals how Smith's ethical and economic theories complement, rather than contradict each other, in addressing complex social problems. Moral sentiments provide individuals with motivation and guidance for ethical behavior within their personal relationships and immediate communities, where they have direct knowledge and emotional connection. Market mechanisms coordinate the activities of strangers who lack personal relationships but can benefit each other through voluntary exchange relationships that require minimal trust and emotional engagement. Both mechanisms serve essential functions in complex societies, but neither alone can address all the coordination problems and moral challenges that such societies face. The charitable foundation example illustrates how this integration works in practice. Trustees' sympathetic responses appropriately focus attention on immediate suffering and provide motivation for charitable action, but such responses need guidance from economic analysis about which interventions would most effectively address the underlying causes of poverty and deprivation. Economic reasoning about program effectiveness should inform charitable decision-making. But such reasoning requires moral foundations about what kinds of outcomes matter, and what obligations wealthy people have toward those in need. Neither pure sympathy nor pure economic calculation provides adequate guidance alone. But combining sympathetic motivation with economic analysis can produce more effective charitable interventions than either approach would generate independently. The deeper philosophical insight concerns Smith's understanding of how moral progress occurs through the interaction between individual moral development and institutional reform. Better institutions create contexts within which individual moral development becomes easier and more effective, while individual moral development creates demand for better institutions and provides guidance about what kinds of institutional reforms would serve human flourishing. Commercial societies provide unprecedented opportunities for both moral and economic development, but realizing those opportunities requires ongoing attention to how market relationships and moral relationships can mutually reinforce rather than undermine each other. This creates a dynamic process of social improvement that operates through neither pure individual virtue nor pure institutional reform, but through their systematic integration over time. The resolution points towards Smith's vision of social science as combining empirical analysis of how institutions actually work with normative analysis of how they ought to work to serve human flourishing. Economic analysis provides knowledge about how different institutional arrangements affect productivity, innovation, and resource allocation, while moral analysis provides guidance about what kinds of outcomes institutional arrangements should promote and what constraints they should respect. Combining these approaches produces more sophisticated understanding of social problems and more effective approaches to addressing them than either purely descriptive social science or purely normative moral philosophy could achieve independently. Smith's lasting contribution lies not in developing separate theories of ethics and economics, but in showing how these domains must be integrated to understand and improve the complex societies that human beings actually create and inhabit. Part 16. Commercial Society and Human Flourishing. The final assessment. After more than 2 centuries of experience with commercial societies, we can evaluate Smith's predictions about their effects on human welfare, individual character, and social relationships. Countries that have embraced market economies and international trade have generally achieved unprecedented levels of material prosperity, technological innovation, and individual freedom compared to both their own histories and contemporary societies that rejected commercial development. But these same societies also exhibit problems that Smith anticipated: extreme inequality, social fragmentation, environmental degradation, and forms of alienation and meaninglessness that raise questions about whether commercial prosperity serves genuine human flourishing or merely creates sophisticated forms of dissatisfaction and social dysfunction. Smith's analysis provides frameworks for understanding both the successes and the limitations of commercial society, while suggesting approaches to institutional reform that could enhance its benefits while addressing its most serious problems. The empirical evidence for commercial society's benefits is overwhelming by historical and comparative standards. Market-oriented societies have virtually eliminated absolute poverty for their citizens, extended life expectancy dramatically, provided educational opportunities that were previously available only to elites, and created unprecedented possibilities for individual mobility and self-determination. Global trade and commercial development have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, created incentives for peaceful cooperation among nations with different political systems, and generated resources for addressing environmental challenges and supporting humanitarian causes worldwide. These achievements represent genuine improvements in human welfare that Smith's analysis predicted would emerge from institutional arrangements that channel self-interest toward beneficial social outcomes through competitive markets and voluntary exchange. But contemporary commercial societies also exhibit systematic problems that raise questions about whether Smith's optimism about commercial development was justified or naive. Extreme wealth concentration creates political inequality that threatens democratic governance. Environmental degradation imposes costs on future generations that current market prices do not reflect, and social fragmentation undermines community relationships and civic engagement in ways that reduce life satisfaction, despite increased material prosperity. Moreover, commercial societies seem to generate forms of psychological distress, status anxiety, and existential meaninglessness that suggest that prosperity alone may not provide adequate foundations for human flourishing. These problems require us to ask whether they represent inevitable costs of commercial development or failures to implement Smith's insights about the institutional requirements for beneficial commercial society. Smith's analysis suggests that many contemporary problems stem from institutional failures rather than inherent defects in commercial society itself. Extreme inequality often reflects rent-seeking, monopolization, and political corruption rather than genuine value creation through productive activity. Environmental degradation represents failures to internalize externalities and account for long-term costs rather than unavoidable consequences of economic growth. Social fragmentation may result from inadequate investment in civic institutions, public goods, and moral education rather than necessary effects of market relationships. Status, anxiety, and meaninglessness might reflect cultural emphasis on material consumption and competitive achievement rather than intrinsic features of commercial prosperity. Addressing these problems requires institutional reforms and cultural development that extend Smith's insights rather than abandoning commercial society entirely. Consider how this analysis applies to contemporary debates about whether technological innovation and economic growth can continue indefinitely without exhausting natural resources or destabilizing social relationships. Smith's framework suggests that sustainable commercial society requires institutional arrangements that account for environmental limits, intergenerational justice and social cohesion alongside immediate economic efficiency. This might involve carbon pricing that reflects climate costs, progressive taxation that prevents excessive wealth concentration, public investment in education and infrastructure that maintains social mobility, and cultural institutions that cultivate values beyond material acquisition. The goal is not limiting growth or innovation, but directing them toward forms that serve comprehensive human flourishing rather than narrow measures of economic output. The philosophical assessment requires balancing Smith's insights against both earlier and later approaches to understanding social organization and human development. Compared to traditional societies based on ascribed status, rigid hierarchy, and limited individual opportunity, commercial societies clearly provide superior opportunities for human development and self-determination. Compared to socialist experiments that attempted to eliminate market relationships entirely, commercial societies have proved far more successful at generating prosperity, innovation, and individual freedom, while avoiding the political oppression and economic stagnation that characterized centrally planned economies. But contemporary environmental challenges, technological disruptions, and global integration create new problems that Smith could not have anticipated and that may require institutional innovations that go beyond his 18th century framework while preserving his core insights about human nature and social cooperation. The deeper question concerns whether commercial society provides adequate space for the full range of human capabilities and aspirations that constitute flourishing lives. Smith's analysis emphasizes economic productivity, individual freedom, and social cooperation through voluntary exchange, but he also recognizes the importance of community relationships, moral virtue, and spiritual development that commercial relationships alone cannot provide. Commercial societies may need complementary institutions that cultivate these other dimensions of human flourishing without undermining the market relationships that generate prosperity and innovation. This might involve strengthening families, religious organizations, civic associations, and cultural institutions that provide meaning, community, and moral development alongside the economic opportunities that commercial society creates. Smith's lasting contribution lies not in providing definitive answers about social organization, but in developing analytical frameworks that can guide ongoing institutional development and reform. His insights about the relationship between individual psychology and institutional design, the importance of balancing freedom with social cooperation, and the need to align individual incentives with collective welfare remain relevant for addressing contemporary challenges that he could not have imagined. Commercial society represents neither the end of history nor a perfect solution to human problems, but a powerful approach to social organization that can continue evolving to serve human flourishing more effectively, while preserving the insights about human nature and social cooperation that make it attractive in the first place. The question is not whether commercial society is perfect, but whether it provides better foundations for human development than available alternatives, while remaining open to reform and improvement based on experience and changing circumstances. Part 17. Smith's Legacy and Contemporary Debates. The Living Philosophy. 250 years after Smith wrote his major works, politicians, economists and philosophers continue invoking his authority to support radically different policy positions and social visions. Free market advocates claim that Smith's invisible hand justifies minimal government regulation and maximum reliance on competitive markets to solve social problems. Progressive reformers argue that Smith's analysis of sympathy and moral sentiments supports substantial government intervention to address inequality and provide public goods that markets cannot supply effectively. Both interpretations capture important elements of Smith's thinking, while potentially distorting his overall philosophical project in ways that reduce complex institutional analysis to simple ideological slogans. The persistence of these debates reflects both the enduring relevance and the interpretive complexity of Smith's philosophical system. His insights about human psychology, market mechanisms, and institutional design address fundamental questions about social organization that every generation must answer anew as circumstances change and new challenges emerge. But his synthetic approach, which combines empirical analysis with normative reflection and balances multiple values that sometimes conflict, resists reduction to simple formulas or ideological positions that would make his work easier to apply but less intellectually honest. Understanding Smith's contemporary relevance requires engaging seriously with the philosophical sophistication of his analysis rather than extracting isolated concepts that support predetermined policy conclusions. Consider how Smith's framework applies to contemporary debates about the appropriate government response to technological unemployment created by artificial intelligence and automation. Pure free market interpretations might argue that technological progress always creates new employment opportunities that compensate for jobs eliminated by innovation, making government intervention unnecessary and potentially harmful. Pure interventionist interpretations might argue that technological displacement requires comprehensive government programs to retrain workers, redistribute wealth, and manage economic transitions that markets cannot handle effectively. Smith's actual analysis suggests a more nuanced approach that examines the specific institutional conditions under which technological change serves human flourishing versus when it requires conscious policy responses to address market failures and social disruption. Smith's approach would likely emphasize that technological unemployment represents a genuine policy challenge that requires institutional responses, but not necessarily comprehensive government control over economic development. The question becomes designing institutions that capture technology's benefits while addressing its costs in ways that preserve individual freedom, maintain incentives for innovation, and ensure that technological progress serves broad-based human flourishing. This might involve education and training programs that help workers adapt to changing skill requirements, social insurance systems that provide security during economic transitions, and tax policies that ensure technology's benefits are shared rather than concentrated among technology owners. But it would also involve maintaining competitive markets that reward genuine innovation and prevent established interests from using government power to protect themselves from beneficial change. The contemporary relevance of Smith's work extends beyond specific policy debates to fundamental questions about how to understand human nature and social relationships in an era of rapid technological and social change. His emphasis on sympathy and moral imagination provides insights for addressing political polarization and social fragmentation that characterize many contemporary democracies. His analysis of how institutional arrangements shape individual behavior offers guidance for designing social media platforms, financial systems, and global governance institutions that align individual incentives with collective welfare. His understanding of the relationship between economic development and moral development helps evaluate whether contemporary forms of prosperity serve genuine human flourishing or merely create sophisticated forms of dissatisfaction and social dysfunction. But applying Smith's insights to contemporary challenges also reveals the limitations of 18th century frameworks for addressing 21st century problems. Climate change involves temporal scales, global coordination challenges, and intergenerational justice questions that exceed the scope of Smith's primarily national and short-term institutional analysis. Artificial intelligence and genetic engineering create possibilities for human enhancement and social control that raise fundamental questions about human nature and individual autonomy that Smith's framework does not directly address. Global economic integration creates interdependencies and vulnerabilities that require new forms of international cooperation and governance that go beyond Smith's analysis of trade relationships among sovereign nations. The productive approach involves extending Smith's methodological insights while adapting his substantive conclusions to contemporary circumstances and knowledge. His emphasis on understanding how institutions actually work in practice, rather than how they appear in theory, provides guidance for evaluating contemporary policy proposals based on empirical evidence rather than ideological commitment. His insistence on balancing multiple values and acknowledging trade-offs rather than pursuing single objectives at any cost offers a more mature approach to policy analysis than either pure market fundamentalism or comprehensive government planning. His recognition that successful institutions must work with rather than against human nature while providing frameworks for moral development remains relevant for designing institutions that serve human flourishing in changing circumstances. Smith's most important contemporary contribution may lie in his approach to social science that combines empirical analysis with moral reflection in ways that inform practical judgment about complex institutional questions. This methodology remains essential for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technical expertise and moral wisdom, detailed knowledge of how institutions actually function, and clear thinking about what kinds of outcomes they should promote. Neither purely technical analysis nor purely moral advocacy provides adequate guidance for designing institutions that serve human flourishing effectively. But combining these approaches in ways that Smith pioneered continues to offer the most promising direction for social improvement. His lasting legacy lies not in specific policy recommendations that may require updating, but in demonstrating how philosophical reflection and empirical investigation can inform each other to produce more sophisticated understanding of human society and more effective approaches to addressing social problems. The final assessment suggests that Smith's work remains vital, not because it provides definitive answers to contemporary questions, but because it demonstrates how to think systematically about the relationship between individual human nature and social institutions in ways that can guide ongoing efforts at social improvement. Every generation faces the challenge of designing institutions that promote human flourishing, given the circumstances and knowledge available to them. And Smith's analytical approach provides enduring guidance for this permanent human task, even as specific institutional solutions must evolve with changing conditions and expanding understanding. Part 18. The Unresolved Tensions. What Smith left unfinished. Despite the comprehensiveness and sophistication of Smith's philosophical system, several fundamental tensions remain unresolved that continue to generate scholarly debate and practical confusion about how to apply his insights consistently. The relationship between individual moral development and institutional reform operates through complex feedback mechanisms that Smith describes but doesn't fully explain, leaving questions about how social progress actually occurs and what role conscious intention plays in beneficial institutional change. The balance between universal moral principles and particular cultural arrangements reflects competing demands for moral objectivity and social effectiveness that Smith acknowledges but cannot definitively reconcile. The temporal dimensions of moral and economic evaluation involve trade-offs between immediate welfare and long-term development that Smith recognizes but doesn't provide clear guidance for resolving when they conflict. The most significant unresolved tension concerns the relationship between Smith's descriptive analysis of how commercial societies actually function and his normative vision of how they ought to function to serve human flourishing. Throughout both major works, Smith moves between explaining why existing institutions work as they do and evaluating whether their outcomes serve appropriate moral goals. But he doesn't always clearly distinguish these different types of analysis or explain how they relate to each other. This creates interpretive problems about whether Smith primarily describes inevitable features of commercial society or advocates for particular institutional arrangements that could be implemented differently with better results. The ambiguity has practical implications because it affects whether his analysis supports accepting existing institutional arrangements as natural and inevitable or working to reform them according to moral principles that existing arrangements may not adequately serve. Consider how this tension appears in Smith's analysis of inequality in commercial societies. He describes wealth concentration as a natural result of differences in talent, effort and fortune that competitive markets tend to reward, suggesting that inequality represents an inevitable feature of any productive economic system. But he also argues that extreme inequality can undermine the moral development, social cooperation, and political institutions that make commercial society beneficial, suggesting that some forms of inequality represent institutional failures rather than natural outcomes. The analysis provides no clear criteria for distinguishing acceptable inequality that reflects genuine differences in productive contribution from problematic inequality that threatens social cooperation and individual flourishing. Similarly, Smith's treatment of government functions exhibits unresolved tensions between minimal state approaches and more extensive public intervention. His analysis of market failures and public goods suggests significant roles for government in education, infrastructure, regulation, and social insurance that go well beyond protecting property rights and enforcing contracts. But his warnings about government inefficiency, rent-seeking, and political oppression suggest skepticism about extensive state power that might undermine the economic freedom and individual liberty that make commercial society attractive. The framework provides general guidance about analysing government interventions case by case, but it doesn't offer clear principles for determining when market failures justify government action versus when government failures make public intervention worse than accepting market limitations. The temporal dimensions of Smith's analysis create additional unresolved tensions between short-term welfare and long-term development that become particularly acute in contemporary policy debates. His emphasis on economic growth and capital accumulation as engines of social progress conflicts with environmental concerns about sustainability and resource depletion that require sacrificing some immediate prosperity for long-term ecological stability. His confidence that commercial development would gradually improve moral sentiments and social relationships conflicts with evidence that some forms of economic growth may undermine community relationships and civic engagement in ways that reduce overall life satisfaction despite increased material prosperity. The analysis provides no clear guidance for balancing immediate welfare gains against potential long-term costs when these considerations conflict. Smith's approach to cultural diversity and moral universalism reflects another set of unresolved tensions that have become more pressing in an era of global integration and multiculturalism. His emphasis on sympathetic understanding and moral imagination suggests openness to different cultural approaches to human flourishing and skepticism about imposing particular moral arrangements on societies with different histories and circumstances. But his confidence that commercial development represents genuine progress toward more advanced forms of social organization suggests universal standards for evaluating different societies and cultural practices that may conflict with cultural relativism and respect for diversity. The tension affects contemporary debates about development policy, humanitarian intervention and immigration that require balancing respect for cultural differences with commitments to human rights and moral progress that transcend cultural boundaries. Perhaps most fundamentally, Smith's analysis leaves unresolved questions about human agency and social determinism that affect how we understand individual responsibility and possibilities for social reform. His emphasis on how institutional arrangements shape individual behavior suggests that social outcomes result primarily from structural factors rather than individual choices, which could support deterministic conclusions about social development that limit possibilities for conscious reform efforts. But his emphasis on moral education and individual virtue suggests that people can transcend their circumstances through moral development and rational reflection, which supports more optimistic conclusions about possibilities for individual and social improvement through conscious effort. The relationship between these perspectives affects fundamental questions about political action, educational policy, and individual responsibility that Smith's framework illuminates but doesn't definitively resolve. These unresolved tensions may represent not failures in Smith's analysis, but recognition that social life involves genuine trade-offs and competing values that cannot be reconciled through theoretical analysis alone, but require practical judgment in specific circumstances. His contribution may lie not in providing definitive solutions to these tensions, but in developing analytical frameworks that help us understand their sources and think more systematically about how to address them in particular contexts. The persistence of these tensions in contemporary debates suggests their fundamental character rather than representing problems that more sophisticated analysis could eliminate entirely. Smith's lasting value may involve teaching us how to think productively about these permanent challenges rather than offering final answers that would eliminate the need for ongoing reflection and practical wisdom in addressing social problems. Part 19. Smith and Modern Behavioral Economics. Psychology meets markets. Contemporary research in behavioral economics has revealed systematic patterns in human decision-making that challenge the rational actor assumptions underlying much modern economic theory, but Smith's 18th-century analysis of moral sentiments and market behavior anticipated many of these findings by centuries. People regularly make choices that contradict their own stated preferences, fall victim to predictable cognitive biases, and respond to social and emotional factors that pure economic rationality would ignore. Rather than undermining Smith's economic theory, these discoveries vindicate his psychological realism and suggest that his analysis of how markets actually work may be more sophisticated than the simplified models that later economists developed in his name. Understanding this connection illuminates both the continuing relevance of Smith's insights and the ways that contemporary research can extend and refine his analysis of human behavior in commercial contexts. Smith's analysis of sympathy and moral sentiments provides a remarkably prescient account of what behavioral economists now call social preferences and other regarding behavior that standard economic models struggle to explain. He argues that people naturally care about others' welfare and seek social approval in ways that influence their economic choices alongside purely self-interested considerations. Contemporary research confirms that people regularly sacrifice material gains to help others, punish unfair behavior, and maintain social relationships even when doing so reduces their economic welfare, according to narrow cost-benefit calculations. But Smith's analysis goes deeper than simply noting that people care about others by explaining the psychological mechanisms through which social concerns influence individual decision-making and the institutional conditions that strengthen or weaken other regarding motivations. Consider how this analysis applies to contemporary findings about ultimatum games and other experimental situations that reveal systematic deviations from purely self-interested behavior. When people are offered unfair divisions of money, they frequently reject proposals that would make them better off financially, rather than accept arrangements they perceive as unfair, even when rejection means both parties receive nothing. Standard economic theory treats such behavior as irrational because it sacrifices material welfare for no apparent benefit, but Smith's framework explains it as reflecting natural moral sentiments that value fairness and reciprocity alongside material gain. The behavior becomes rational when we understand that people value social relationships and moral integrity in ways that purely monetary calculations cannot capture adequately. Smith's recognition that economic behavior depends heavily on social context and institutional arrangements anticipates contemporary research on how framing effects, social norms, and institutional design influence individual choices. He argues that the same individual will behave differently in market relationships versus family relationships versus political relationships because different contexts activate different aspects of human psychology and create different incentive structures. Behavioral economists have confirmed that small changes in how choices are presented, what social norms are salient, and what institutions structure decision-making can dramatically affect behavior without changing underlying preferences or material incentives. This suggests that institutional design involves not just creating appropriate incentives, but understanding how different institutional arrangements interact with human psychology to promote or discourage beneficial behavior. The implications extend to contemporary debates about market efficiency and the appropriate role of government regulation in addressing behavioral biases and market failures. If people systematically make choices that contradict their own long-term welfare due to cognitive limitations, emotional influences, and social pressures, then market outcomes may not serve human flourishing as effectively as traditional economic theory suggests. This could justify paternalistic interventions that protect people from their own poor decisions through regulations that limit harmful choices or institutional designs that make beneficial choices easier and more attractive. But Smith's analysis suggests caution about such interventions because individual choices reflect not just cognitive errors, but also social values and psychological needs that external observers may not fully understand or appreciate. Smith's approach to these issues emphasizes improving the institutional context within which people make choices rather than overriding individual decision-making through regulatory mandates. If people make poor financial decisions due to inadequate information, the solution involves improving financial education and disclosure requirements rather than prohibiting particular financial products entirely. If people fail to save adequately for retirement due to present bias and procrastination, the solution involves automatic enrollment in retirement plans with opt-out provisions rather than mandatory savings requirements that eliminate individual choice. The goal is creating institutional arrangements that work with, rather than against, natural human psychology, while preserving individual autonomy and the benefits of decentralized decision-making that market systems provide. But contemporary behavioral research also reveals psychological biases and social influences that Smith did not fully anticipate, and that may require institutional responses that go beyond his 18th century framework. Social media and digital technology create unprecedented opportunities for manipulation of consumer preferences through targeted advertising, algorithmic curation, and social influence techniques that exceed anything Smith could have imagined. Financial markets exhibit herd behavior, speculative bubbles, and systematic mispricing that suggest more serious departures from rational valuation than Smith's analysis of market corrections would predict. Global supply chains and complex financial instruments create systemic risks and coordination problems that exceed the scope of Smith's primarily local and national institutional analysis. The productive synthesis involves combining Smith's insights about human psychology and institutional design with contemporary knowledge about cognitive biases, social influences, and system complexity to develop more sophisticated approaches to market regulation and institutional reform. This requires neither abandoning market mechanisms, because they don't work perfectly, nor accepting market outcomes uncritically, because they reflect individual choices. Instead, it involves ongoing empirical analysis of how different institutional arrangements interact with human psychology to produce various outcomes, and continuous institutional experimentation and reform based on evidence about what actually serves human flourishing most effectively. Smith's lasting contribution lies not in providing final answers about institutional design, but in demonstrating how psychological realism and empirical analysis can inform institutional reform that preserves individual freedom while addressing systematic sources of market failure and social dysfunction. Part 20. The Enduring Questions, Smith's Philosophy for the Future. As we face challenges that Smith could never have imagined, artificial intelligence reshaping employment, climate change requiring global cooperation across generations, genetic engineering raising fundamental questions about human nature, and digital technologies transforming social relationships, the question becomes whether his philosophical framework retains relevance for addressing genuinely novel problems or represents merely historical interest in the development of social thought. The answer depends not on whether Smith's specific policy recommendations or institutional analyses apply directly to contemporary circumstances, but on whether his methodological approaches and fundamental insights about human nature and social cooperation provide enduring guidance for thinking about whatever challenges human societies will face. His lasting contribution may lie in demonstrating how to think systematically about the relationship between individual psychology and social institutions in ways that can guide institutional design and moral development across changing historical circumstances. Smith's core insight that human flourishing depends on institutional arrangements that channel individual motivations toward beneficial social outcomes while preserving individual freedom and moral agency remains relevant regardless of specific technological or environmental circumstances. Whether the challenge involves regulating artificial intelligence, addressing climate change, managing global economic integration, or designing democratic institutions for diverse societies, the fundamental task involves understanding how different institutional arrangements interact with human psychology to produce various outcomes and designing institutions that promote human flourishing given realistic assumptions about human capabilities and motivations. This requires neither utopian expectations about human virtue nor cynical assumptions about inevitable selfishness, but careful empirical analysis of how different institutional contexts bring out different aspects of human nature and create different possibilities for individual development and social cooperation. The methodological approach Smith pioneered, combining detailed empirical observation with moral reflection to inform practical judgment about institutional design, provides guidance for addressing contemporary challenges that require both technical expertise and ethical wisdom. Climate change involves complex scientific questions about atmospheric chemistry and economic modelling, but it also raises fundamental moral questions about intergenerational justice, global cooperation, and the relationship between current consumption and future welfare that cannot be resolved through technical analysis alone. Artificial intelligence involves sophisticated questions about machine learning and computational systems, but it also raises essential questions about human agency, democratic governance, and the appropriate relationship between human judgment and algorithmic decision-making that require philosophical reflection alongside technical development. Smith's approach suggests that addressing such challenges effectively requires integration of scientific knowledge with moral analysis rather than treating them as purely technical problems that experts can solve without broader democratic deliberation and moral reflection. His emphasis on sympathetic understanding and moral imagination provides essential guidance for addressing political polarization, cultural conflict, and global cooperation challenges that threaten democratic governance and international stability. The capacity to understand others' perspectives, imagine how policies affect different groups, and reason about shared moral principles that can guide collective action becomes increasingly important as societies become more diverse and interconnected while facing challenges that require unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual understanding. This doesn't require abandoning particular commitments or accepting moral relativism, but developing more sophisticated approaches to moral reasoning that can identify common ground for social cooperation while respecting legitimate differences in values and priorities. Smith's analysis of how moral judgment develops through social interaction and reflective analysis provides a framework for civic education and democratic deliberation that remains essential for addressing complex challenges through collective action rather than authoritarian imposition or anarchic competition. Perhaps most importantly, Smith's recognition that individual moral development and institutional reform must proceed together through ongoing interaction provides guidance for approaching social change in ways that preserve human agency, while addressing systematic sources of social dysfunction. Contemporary challenges often generate calls for either purely individual solutions that ignore structural constraints on individual choice or purely institutional solutions that ignore individual responsibility and moral agency. Climate change exemplifies this false dichotomy. Some approaches emphasize individual lifestyle changes while ignoring how institutional arrangements make sustainable choices difficult or impossible for most people, while other approaches emphasize policy reforms while ignoring how individual attitudes and behaviors ultimately determine whether institutional changes will be effective and sustainable. Smith's framework suggests that addressing such challenges requires coordinated attention to both individual moral development and institutional reform that mutually reinforce each other over time. The questions that will determine whether Smith's philosophy remains relevant for future challenges involve not whether his 18th century analysis anticipated 21st century problems, but whether the human nature he analyzed and the institutional principles he developed retain their validity across changing historical circumstances. Do people still respond to incentives in ways that institutional arrangements can channel toward beneficial or harmful outcomes? Do moral sentiments still develop through sympathetic understanding and social interaction in ways that can be cultivated through appropriate education and cultural institutions? Do successful institutions still require balancing individual freedom with social cooperation, immediate welfare with long-term development, and universal principles with particular circumstances? Do complex social challenges still require combining empirical analysis with moral reflection to inform practical judgment about institutional design and social reform? If these questions retain affirmative answers despite technological and social changes, then Smith's analytical approach remains relevant, even if his specific conclusions require updating based on new circumstances and expanded knowledge. The final assessment suggests that Smith's enduring contribution lies not in providing a completed social philosophy that subsequent generations can simply apply to new problems, but in demonstrating how philosophical reflection and empirical investigation can inform each other to produce more sophisticated understanding of human society and more effective approaches to promoting human flourishing. Each generation faces the task of designing institutions appropriate to its circumstances and knowledge, while drawing on accumulated wisdom about human nature and social cooperation that previous thinkers have developed. Smith's work provides essential resources for this ongoing task, but realizing their potential requires active engagement with contemporary challenges rather than passive acceptance of historical authority. His philosophy remains alive only insofar as it continues to illuminate human experience and inform human choices about how to live together in ways that serve individual development and collective welfare under whatever circumstances the future may bring.